today we're honored to have Arjun from Connext as our seminar speaker. So Arjun started off his career by co-creating Moloch DAO, and now he's the founder and chief typewriter monkey at Connext. So Arjun, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for the intro and thanks for having me. This is a really awesome community. Yes, I am a monkey with a typewriter at Connext. As mentioned, I was one of the people who helped start the Moloch DAO. The other Connext founders also helped with that, and then along with Amin Salamani and James Young from the SpankChain team, we had actually started Connext before that, and we were working really closely with SpankChain at that point. And we just sort of had this idea around building a simpler minimum viable DAO mechanism for coordination because of a problem that we were having or something that we had wanted to do in the future, which is figure out a way to do like token acquisitions. And this is kind of like a solution to that, to like have people coordinate around some public good. So yeah, thanks for having me. What's, I guess, the best place to get started? I can give a bit of background about Connext and myself, if that's a good start, but also happy to jump into like more specifics.
I think that would be good, Arjun, like to see overall background, and then particularly with this crowd, a focus on Connext's security approach, and then we'll get into questions.
Yeah. Cool. So we started Connext back in 2017. The reason for starting it was the three of the founders have just like a very high conviction in decentralized protocols and the ability for blockchains to be able to create public goods that can be non-corporate, non-sovereign, which we think is actually going to really, really improve the world. And our thesis at the time was that this technology already exists with Ethereum. Let's just find a way to scale it, and let's find a way to bring it to a large audience. Now, naturally, this led us to the most pressing problem in the space, which was scalability. So in 2018, we started working really closely with SpankChain, which is one of the only projects with any traction at the time, on building out basically building out state channels. And we actually built one of the first L2s on Ethereum, which was a state channel network that powered SpankChain's micropayments, and then also started to power other kinds of payments in the space. We spent a bunch of time working really closely with the L2 ecosystem, and then I guess a lot of the people that were at the time were just like R&D. So a lot of the folks who now are building rollups and who are kind of leading the charge on L2s and on scalability were all folks that at the time we were all just kind of like stumbling around in the dark trying to figure out how to make Ethereum work more cheaply. And this is and so it's kind of interesting to see the way that how far we've come. Naturally, the scalability conversations turned largely towards rollups, starting in like 2019, 2020, and I think the reason for that was that projects like ours that were working on state channels required a very kind of niche, required sort of a relatively niche use case, which was payments, and at the time, the only thing that really had any traction was DeFi. I think even now, payments on blockchains is still just not a market that has taken off, and I think. We've kind of amended our hypotheses about it, and now think that it's actually going to be like a tailing adoption thing rather than a leading adoption thing, because the payment space is just so hard to break into, things like that. Anyway, so getting back to kind of how we ended up with what we're doing today. So in 2020, we kind of saw this proliferation of rollups, and we realized that there was going to be this problem associated with user experience and like user adoption, which is going to be how do you actually abstract away the process of needing to know what rollup or chain that you're on from the user. How do you make it so that users and application developers can build things, can basically utilize natively cross-chain applications where they don't have to think about what chain they're on, they don't have to think about what chain they're building with, they can just like work on utilizing applications in the same way that you kind of build web applications today, where you're utilizing resources from a bunch of different remote places, and you are interacting with those resources asynchronously. We went live with this last January. We went live with like a sort of simple version of this that was built using state channels that just allow you to do cross-chain transfers. And then over time, we've fleshed this out to do like initially some types of more expressive cross-chain contract calls. And then now with the new upgrade that's going out that we're planning to get audited with Spearbit DAO soon, the idea is to have just fully expressive communication between blockchains in partnership with Nomad. So how does that work? So the whole concept of allowing for communication between chains is really, really interesting and relatively new. It's a relatively new discussion, at least from the perspective of like the application layer and from the perspective of like something that people are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Now, of course, people have been trying to build interoperability systems for years, and we've been able to leverage a lot of the learnings from those things. So like some of the earliest kind of interoperability mechanisms were things like atomic swaps, which allow you to swap, BTC for ETH using HTLCs. And those who don't know, HTLCs are hash time lock contracts where you you basically put both parties put their funds into an escrow with a timeout and then exchange some sort of mechanisms, usually like a signature or a key that allows them to unlock each other's escrow. Now what we've seen from over the course of the last couple of years is that there's a bunch of different ways that people have started to build bridges, and we've been able to largely derive a taxonomy from this and understand the trade-off space. So last year we put something forward called the interoperability trilemma. And the interoperability trilemma states that there's a very interesting trade-off space around building bridges, which is that it's very hard to have, at least within the Ethereum ecosystem, it's very hard to have a bridge or interop system that is simultaneously trustless, or trust minimized at least, generalized, which means can pass around any arbitrary data, and is easy to deploy on all of these extremely heterogeneous systems. So like it can work the same way on rollups as it does on Polygon, as it does on Avalanche, as it does on whatever XYZ thing might get built in the future. We call this last property extensibility, but of course it can be called a lot of different things. What we found was that there was this trade-off space basically led to three types of bridges that currently exist, or at least existed until relatively recently out in the market. The first was atomic swap or atomic swap systems like ours using HTLCs or sometimes slightly more nuanced mechanisms. And that is what exists today with Connext, which is you have a user give money conditionally to some liquidity provider, and then the liquidity provider fronts capital for the user on a receiving chain and may call a contract on their behalf as part of that. And the kind of challenge with that mechanism is that while it is trustless, or at least reasonably trust minimized, and while it is easy to deploy the system everywhere because it just runs as a set of smart contracts as part of the EVM, it's inherently less generalized, right? You're delegating to some LP to call a contract on your behalf, which means if your contract is checking message sender, or if it's checking if it basically has any sort of permissioning whatsoever, that call would fail. There would be no way to actually do a permission call in that sense because there would be no way to really know that this person had the rights to call this contract at a given time. And that gets us into the other two mechanisms, which have largely become more common, more popular recently because of this need to have interoperability that is more generalized and can be deployed everywhere. So the first is multi-sig bridges, and as I'm sure you guys are aware, those are can be anything in the range of like a one multi-sig, which is really just like a custodial server. And there's many of those. I think Avalanche SDX is one of the quintessential examples of that, where they have just like I think they've improved this, but they, for a very, very unreasonably long time, just had a single key sitting in an embedded device somewhere that was like signing for transactions going from Ethereum to Avalanche. And then you can have slightly more, like basically the same construction with more signers. An example of this is like the Ronin bridge, where there's like a 5 out of 9 validator set, so you need 5 out of 9 signatures, and then that can go up to sort of like effectively what looks like a POS chain. So this is kind of like the Thorchain model or the Axelar model, where you have a much potentially permissionless set of validators, though of course there are like limits to this, just from like Cosmos chains and things like that. There are like upper limits on the number of validators you can have. And in this obviously gives better economic security, but then once again you still have the same kind of core property of like this is an additional validator set that exists between the Ethereum L1 and some other chain that you're on. So now you're introducing assumption, which is effectively the trust assumption of whatever validator set is like relaying these transactions. So we've gone like years now trying to build rollups, and the idea was to avoid having some external set of validators that you rely on when similar to like how like to what you would the assumptions that you would be making when you're using a sidechain. And so introducing another third-party validator set in the between your rollup to rollup transaction is sort of kind of defeats the purpose, right? It's like at that point, why did we spend years building rollups? We should have just gone with sidechains to begin with. Now, the last mechanism, and we kind of call this like natively verified bridges, is perhaps the most interesting, and that is things that look like IBC or the near rainbow bridge, where these are sometimes also called like client header relays, but the idea is like you are verifying the consensus of one chain within the VM of another. So you're running like a light client of one chain and another, and by doing that, you can actually verify that a state transition that happened in that on that chain is valid, and that is in theory the most trustless mechanism to bridge, because you're actually verifying what's happening on the chain. You're having like the validator set B from chain B just natively look into what's happening on chain A. But there's obviously a lot of complexity here, because in order to do this, you have to build a light client for the chain that you're actually validating, and that's in most cases that is difficult, and in many cases that is impossible. So for example, it is extremely difficult on Ethereum on Ethpow because the Ethereum was like created in this time where a bunch of chains did this thing where they thought memory hardness would make them ASIC resistant, and it didn't really. And it ended up being like not a very fruitful endeavor, but it did have the very unfortunate consequence of making it pretty much impossible to build light clients for them, at least in a way that is like resource efficient and like can be executed on chain. So for Ethpow, it's extraordinarily difficult to build a light client because it just costs an assload of money to verify block headers and verify that within like Ethereum's POW consensus mechanism. For other chains, so for example, or other systems, for example, for optimistic rollups, it's actually just impossible. There is no, technically speaking, what the rollup is posting to Ethereum L1 and running in the dispute is the light client. And so if you use a light client to try to validate that, you're still just going to run into the exact same issue that you run into with rollups currently, which is you need to wait 7 days for that state to be finalized before you can actually trust it. And so you sort of end up in this like recursive place where the natively verified system that you've created doesn't really make sense. Now this is kind of like the bridge landscape at a high level. In earlier and like with what exists today, we have Connext uses the first mechanism, which is atomic swaps, which allows us to have the trust minimization properties that we want, but then and like be able to deploy Connext everywhere, but kind of trade off the ability to do generalized contract calling. Now, the key innovation that's happened in the last, it happened a while ago, and I think that like the Nomad team that built this has been thinking about it for a very long time. I know that James has been like working on cross-chain bridging. James Prestwich has been working on cross-chain bridging for years and years now, far longer than most people in the space. But the key innovation there is this idea of an optimistic bridge. So rather than requiring all of these like on-chain dependencies, like with a native bridge, or requiring an external validator set, like with a multi-sig bridge, or requiring trading off generalizability with a atomic swaps or local bridge, you instead use a mechanism that works very, very similar to optimistic rollups. You use fraud proofs to relay data across chains, and the core principle of this is very simple. You just have some parties, so anybody can make an update to the bridge, which is just send some transaction to the bridge with some arbitrary payload. You have some party called an updater that just sees this incoming payload, hashes it, and like hashes all other incoming payloads into and like adds them to a Merkle tree, generates a root, and then signs the root, and then posts that to the sending chain. And then, again, similar to an optimistic rollup, you just optimistically relay that route across chains and then wait. So in the optimistic bridge case, you send that signed route to the receiving chain, and then it's just in this pending state for 30 minutes. Within that 30-minute window, anyone can come and dispute this transaction. So the idea is that you could theoretically have an open permissionless watcher set. This is, of course, permissioned right now while it's being rolled out, but eventually you can get the point where there's no real way for anyone to know who is actually watching the chain. And so there's never really any way for the updater to commit fraud, because it's always economically unviable for them to attempt it. And the reason for this is that if you are an updater and you are attempting fraud, you don't know if there is a single watcher that is watching the chain that you could potentially fool or bribe. You don't know if there's 100 watchers. You don't know if there's 10,000 watchers. And because there can always be at least one more watcher, the cost of trying to bribe the system, the cost of trying to pay off every watcher that exists, is theoretically unbounded. There's always an incentive for at least one watcher to be like, no, I'm going to dispute this. And the incentive for watchers to do this is that similar to an optimistic rollup, the updater bonds some capital up front as part of doing their job, and that bond gets slashed. Now, of course, there's a bunch of gotchas to this. Like the 30-minute window sometimes is quite alarming to people. There is actually a lot of thought that went into that and a lot of parameterization. So I'm happy to jump into that if that's a question that folks have. The other kind of question is around okay, well, how safe is that really? What are the kind of trade-offs of fraud proofs? One obvious trade-off is that now you have latency, and that is really the key thing that we see is with an optimistic bridge, you get the three highly desirable properties that we talked about, where it's very easy to deploy this system to every chain because it's really just the only dependency that you have is ECDSA, and or I guess generally signatures. I think you could probably make it work with any sort of signature format. And then aside from that, you just need a chain that is capable of processing arbitrary data. In addition to that, it's trust minimized. It gives the same sort of core trust properties and has the same trust model as rollups do. Now, of course, the 30-minute window is something to discuss there, and we can chat about what that means for the trust model. And then lastly, it is generalizable. So you can pass any arbitrary data through this because ultimately what is being relayed is just a Merkle root. So a lot of info. I guess the last thing to kind of say here is the direction that Connext is going in the future is we really have a lot of conviction around optimistic bridges. We think that they are going to be the best in class. They actually offer the theoretical best security, just because the consequences of trying to build natively verified bridges everywhere are somewhat untenable, and they won't work in many cases. So the next best thing ends up being optimistic bridges. And we think that there are ways, we know that there are ways to kind of mitigate some of the latency trade-offs of optimistic bridges by using the atomic swap mechanism that we talked about in the beginning. So similar to an optimistic rollup, in an ORU, the reason that you wait 7 days for any potential disputes to happen on layer 1 is not because you don't know if fraud has occurred. It's because the chain doesn't know fraud has occurred. So the 7-day latency is to account for the fact that it may take some time for someone to prove fraud. However, off-chain, it is very easy to see the latest block or latest state of the chain of the rollup itself, and then compare that to the route that has been posted to L1. And the same kind of process exists on an optimistic bridge. So because you can do that, you can always have somebody take on the risk. And that's effectively what we do, and that's effectively what we're building, is a way for people to come and take on the risk of running an optimistic bridge by just having an off-chain verifier that says, again, similar to an atomic swap mechanism, says, oh, cool, someone transferred value over the system, or they want to go do XYZ using the system. I can see off-chain that no fraud has occurred. I'm willing to just front my capital for this if they're willing to pay me some fees. Cool. I'm going to pause there because I know that was a lot of information. I have written resources also to follow up with after this for everybody, for all of these things.
And for the video that we post on YouTube, we're going to link those resources. So Arjun, yeah, a follow-up question would be if you could go into more detail on how exactly 30 minutes was selected, number one. And then also, you're kind of poking at like some of the non-technical ways to mitigate this risk by potentially allowing market makers to kind of mitigate the risk off-chain. But just curious if you could go into that more as well.
Yeah. So the 30-minute window. So there actually has never been a very formal parameterization of like fraud-proof windows. This is something that we want to do. We just haven't had the time to really like, do the research and write something up around it. But I think 7 days is actually, I don't think that is actually absolutely necessary. I think that, I know the design process that went into Rollup. I know for a fact that this was somewhat arbitrarily. There has been some research into figuring out what is actually a safe amount of time to wait. So on Ethereum L1, for example, especially with EIP 1559, the cost of trying to censor the chain and spam the chain in order to censor transactions actually increases exponentially. And it becomes pretty untenable extremely quickly. So I think like I did some math around this. So basically, for those, I'm sure you guys all know, but like EIP 159, if you're filling the block, the percentage cost, like the base fee of each transaction goes up by like 12.5% per block, and then obviously that grows to untenable. So like what we looked into was like, okay, the like gas cost that you would end up having to pay, the gas price after like the 30-minute window of trying to DOS the chain outright ends up being like in the like I think it's like 10 to the 15 Gwei, or 10 to 15 Gwei or something like that. It was ridiculous. So we were just like, okay, well that's not going to be reasonable for anyone to pay anytime soon. In addition to that, we also kind of looked into, it was far more than that. Yeah, I'll check the numbers on that and post them after this. In addition to that, what we also looked into is like, okay, what is the gas cost of, or what is the cost of actually trying to bribe miners to basically shun a transaction, to like not post it. And this also gets into something that's pretty interesting, which is like, in order to have 100% certainty that a fraud transaction is not going to get posted, you need to bribe 100% of the miner set. And you need to make sure that not a single miner defects. And this is actually true in POS as well. You need to make sure that not a single validator will defect. Because fundamentally it's a probabilistic, right? So even if you have a controlling stake in a chain, and you're able to say like, okay, my attempt at fraud is going to succeed 99% of the time, you need to do that for 30 blocks. And that, once again, those numbers become just really, really like very, very uneconomical. Because the reality is, as a person who is attempting fraud in the system, you only need one person to actually succeed in proving that fraud occurred for you to lose funds. So it's more of an economic calculus than anything. Now, the place that I think I'm still interested in looking into, and there's been quite a bit of back and forth around this, is to see how this like replicates itself onto some other chains. I think we're very, very confident that the same kind of process can be applied to things like Polygon and Avalanche and things like that. One place that I'm interested in specifically is like Tendermint chains. So I think with Tendermint chains, the way that Tendermint applies, the way that Tendermint handles censorship is a little bit different, and it's actually less aggressively penalized than on other chains, I believe, or at least generally, like from what I've gathered. And this is something that I don't have enough of an understanding yet, but I know James and the Nomad team have looked quite in depth. But the idea with Tendermint is that it may actually be possible to build like better bribing mechanisms where it's like the censorship itself is not like an attributable fault, so there's no way to really know or penalize anybody for it. But once again, it's like the base requirements needed for something like this to happen end up looking like, okay, we're controlling the validator set. And if you're controlling the validator set on a chain, there's actually just an even easier way to attack a bridge, which is to produce an invalid update in the first place. And that's happening on the chain itself. And so now there's nothing that the bridge, in theory, there's because all a bridge is doing is relaying whatever update the chain gives it. So I think one thing that we've seen is like, in general, it looks as though the conditions, our assumptions around how economically feasible it is to completely censor a chain and ensure that zero transactions can get through of a certain type are actually more difficult than generally people estimate them to be at the moment. Just mathematically, given like the ways in which these chains respond to basically like the probabilities of success of these kinds of attacks. And then secondly, if you are able to engineer circumstances where this can happen, I believe in most, if not all cases, this requires controlling the actual actual miner set or the validator chain to begin with, or at least having like majority control over it. And in that case, there are actually much easier ways to attack this. And of course, in that case, there are much bigger problems associated with your chain that we should just be much more concerned about in the first place. Yeah. Does anyone have any follow-up questions on that? Because I can definitely like go into it, like specifics.
Yeah, Axik had some follow-up questions in the Q&A, Arjun. And then I'll just read them out here. And then if you could also speak a little closer to the mic, because your mic kind of cut out a little bit. So his follow-up question.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah. Are you just proving the state of the bridge on one side or the other? That means you can use different tree systems on different networks as long as the data structure is understood on the receiving end. So if you could go into more detail on that.
As you mentioned, that off-chain, it can be verified with more conviction. Do you think sex is white test or what? So is this, okay, so it looks like this is about the second piece. So it's actually not that, it's not that you're verifying it with more conviction. It's that like, so the base condition for a fraud proof is that it is always possible for anybody off-chain to see that fraud has occurred at any time. Right, because in order to prove that fraud has occurred, all you really need to know is like the state of both chains, which you can always get at any time off chain very easily, in theory. Of course, like assumptions being that you're running a node and things like that. But so it's not just that like it's more secure to prove that fraud has occurred off chain, or like you can do it more securely. It's that it is actually the only way to prove that fraud has occurred, and you can do that instantly in all cases. Now, traditionally in the Nomad flow or in any sort of optimistic system, you basically see that fraud has occurred on chain, and then you prove that fraud has happened. Or you see that fraud has occurred off chain, then you prove that fraud has happened on chain. And the delay window doesn't exist as a mechanism within which you are able to see fraud has occurred off chain. It is instead a way to make sure that proof can happen in time on chain. Now, the reason that I wanted to clarify that is that from the perspective of an off-chain actor or a system like ours, which the atomic swap system like ours that basically utilizes specifically off-chain components and specifically like an individual off-chain actor that looks at both chains and says, "Oh, I'm willing to front the capital for this because the conditions have been met for me to do that, and I can be 100% certain that I'm going to get paid." For within that kind of system, it's very easy for us to look at Nomad and say, yeah, no fraud has occurred. Effectively, what we're doing is just running Nomad watchers, right? We are watching the chain and seeing if fraud has occurred, and like we're actually building in the fraud-proof mechanisms directly. We will build in the fraud-proof mechanisms directly into our code to begin with, so in that way, like automatically out of the box, there are like however many Connext routers are running, however many agents are running in Connext are also like verifying Nomad. And so from the perspective of Connext, the idea is just like, it's sort of the same model as something like a cross or hop, where you are using in hop, like what you're doing is you're sending a transaction over the rollup bridge that's going from L2 to L1, and you just have some liquidity provider that's fronting capital for that transaction. And then they're just taking the lockup, right? They're effectively like a lender. They're just lending you capital, and then they're just asking you for the cost of that upfront because they know exactly what the fixed maturity of that loan will be. And so I hope that gives a little bit more of an understanding. It's like a secondary piece, which is just like it's almost like a DeFi. It's not exactly like a DeFi protocol. It's almost like a DeFi protocol that ends up getting built on top of the system that is like specifically designed to lend capital to users on receiving chains in return for capital that is inbound after a certain time window, in this case 30 minutes. Cool. So
can I clarify by any chance? Because I think the questions, there are like two different questions mixed up. And what this question was about is basically, since off-chain you can see the state, and if you trust that the fraud-proof system works properly, then there will be no way to misprove it, aka the transaction will always be valid. And could a centralized system utilize this information to actually consider such transactions valid even before, like, the time limit for submitting fraud proofs?
Yes, and that's actually exactly what we do.
So would you imagine like a centralized wallet provider to accept your receiving transactions as valid even before? Do you think there would be some such integration, or everybody will just rely on the on-chain?
One thing that we've learned is that like requiring any integrations with like wallets or exchanges is just like it just takes forever, because like the security principles that wallets and exchanges are following in order to like be very conservative about what they like add to their systems are rigorous enough that like scaling integrations there is just not viable. And we've tried to scale like wallet integrations in the past for like previous things that we built. So from it is possible, entirely possible, to like build this directly into the wallet layer or build this directly into an exchange layer. And in fact, it's actually entirely possible for wallets today to do something interesting, like, I am seeing a transaction coming out of Optimism, and it's going to take this 7-day window. Like, let me actually like just like show it as it is fully appeared in a user's wallet at this point. And in fact, I can even do things like allow users to transfer these credits to each other. And you can build an entire system on top of this, where you allow users to transfer credits to each other using funds that are actually locked up in the optimistic bridge. And this, it's like a way to kind of like think about what is happening in the system. But now the main difficulty is like, okay, now you need a way to track these credits, and now you need a way to make sure that they are attributed without custody risk and things like that. And so once you get into those problems, it's like, okay, well, at that point, you might as well just do this whole thing on chain by having somebody front the capital for it, because it's just easier to track. But yes, I think the answer to your question is yes, it is 100% possible for people to do this. It's just like more practical to do it on chain than it is to do it, like basically to have the implementation or the kind of like process of having the capital be available and in somebody's wallet. It's much easier to track that on chain than it is to require people to have custom off-chain code.
Got it. Another question from Leastwood. How does the complexity of an optimistic bridge like Near's Raymer bridge differ versus like an HTLC bridge combined with fraud proofs?
So basically, like we are running on top of the optimistic bridge, so it's not like we're. So one thing to note here is like there is HTLCs which use like atomic swaps using HTLCs, which use like contracts on chain that escrow funds. The implementation on chain of that is not very complex. It's just like basically just an escrow that has a timed unlock. But the complexity is in off-chain pieces. So there is off-chain coordination that needs to happen between the user and the liquidity provider. So you need to have some sort of way to match users to LPs, which has to exist completely off-chain. I mean, I guess it could be on-chain, but that would just be like prohibitively costly. And then you have to have basically you have to have liveness. You have to have the LP have liveness, which is not as much of a problem, but you also have to have the user have liveness. The user has to like be online after they send the transaction on the sending chain to claim the transaction on the receiving chain. And that is just like a whole user experience, complex user experience hurdle that in some cases, like depending on the construction and depending on the way that you design your system, could also lead to lost funds. And the reason for that is that like these things do have on-chain timeouts to prevent cases where people just end up sending their funds into this and then get DOSed and then their funds are locked forever. But those on-chain timeouts mean that like if people aren't doing a good job of being live or watching the chain, their funds may just get returned back to sender, and like they may have already sent funds to somebody else as part of the transaction. Now, the optimistic bridges individually as an isolated construction are also not very complex. And the cool thing with them is that the complexity is like the lack of complexity exists both on chain and off chain. So all you're really doing on chain is on the sending chain, you're just adding things to a Merkle tree and signing them. And on the receiving chain, you're doing an inclusion proof and verifying signature. That's it. And then you have some very low overhead dispute code that runs on, I guess, on the sending chain and disconnection code, quote unquote, which is similar to dispute that runs on the receiving chain, where you have where you're just slashing somebody that actually does do fraud. The off-chain pieces there are also quite simple. It's just like signing and relaying transactions across chains. So it's more about like guaranteeing fulfillment of the transaction rather than having like explicit coordination. And the failure modes are also kind of straightforward, where it's like, worst case scenario, your off-chain agents just like went offline and stopped responding. And it would be the same as like, it's obviously bad from a liveness perspective, and you can work towards decentralizing those agents. But it's a similar situation to like when the arbiter rollup sequencer stopped, where like you can just restart it. There's no funds are never at risk there. The system integrity is never compromised. You have a liveness failure, not a safety failure. Now, I guess the specific question here is, what does it look like to have the combination of, the atomic swap system running on top of the optimistic system, and does that lead to added complexity? In my opinion, no. And I think the reason for this is that while there is individual complexity on the HTLC system, you're actually able to take an entirely different approach to atomic swaps when you have this optimistic layer sitting underneath than you would with an HTLC. The thing, and this gets a little bit more into like the theory of HTLCs, but like the thing that keeps an HTLC secure is that you have a signature that's provided, or like signature or hash or something, some sort of cryptographic proof that is used as the, for lack of a better term, as the transport of security between chains, right? You have something that is revealed on the receiving chain that could only have been produced by the original person who created the transaction. And because that is revealed on the receiving chain, it can now be revealed on this. It can now be utilized to unlock funds on the sending chain. Fundamentally, though, that is an off-chain process. And so you have, rather than having some sort of inbuilt mechanism to message across chains, you now have these people like going through this like interactive exchange process of proofs. In the optimistic bridge case, you actually don't need that anymore. You can use the bridge itself as a transport of that message. So you don't, rather than having this mechanism where you're sending funds, unlocking on the receiving chain, and then claiming on the sending chain, you now actually have a forward payment, forward transfer, or forward execution, where you just have something that is going from chain A to chain B, and it's going to take a certain amount of time. And on chain B, you have somebody just front liquidity for it because they know there's a message coming across the bridge. And as long as they're able to, like, there are some like clever mechanisms for how to do this. What we do is like we basically just like hash the we basically just make it so that the params needed to transfer are like hashed as part of the transfer that is going across the bridge, and then the router that like fronts the capital on the receiving chain also hashes the same params, and like those params are used to like execute the transaction, so the transaction was executed correctly. And then on the receiving chain, all you're doing is like quote unquote bonding to that hash. You're basically like within the mapping that is storing all of these hashes that are associated with transfers, so basically like transfer IDs. You are saying that a transfer occurred at this transfer ID by a router, and at some point in the future, the bridge at like 30 minutes later comes and says, "Oh, okay, I have a transfer coming over this thing with the same transfer ID which has the same hash params. Has anyone already done this? If not, I'm going to do this." And if somebody has done this, then the funds go to the person who did it, and if they haven't done it, then the funds go back to the user. So there's no sort of like, there's no real way to like cheat that, because if a router tries to send funds somewhere else, the hash of those params will actually be different, and then they will lose funds because now they're not getting repaid for their transfer. But yeah, the key point here is that like you don't need to have this like really complex off-chain interaction. You actually don't need very many off-chain pieces at all. You don't have to have like a mapping, one-to-one mapping between a user and an LP. You don't have to have matching between them. And instead, what you can just do is have this like really, really simple process where anybody can just come and dump liquidity into the thing, with the caveat that, of course, you want to avoid like MEV and front running and stuff like that if possible.
Maybe just a brief follow-up. You kind of explained the data structures, but since there's so many different networks out there, many of them not even using EVM, technically, all you need to do is just have a data structure which you can prove and you agree to it. But my question would be, are there any standards for this? Or for each of these chains, there's like a separate system in place? Or is there any kind of standard or standards which can be used across the different chains?
There really aren't any standards. We're having to kind of like figure these out in real time as we go along. I think like the core requirement, and this I saw Jake, you also posted a question on this. The core requirement is really just like you have expressive computing, like basically you have a Turing complete execution environment on the receiving chain and on the sending chain. And if you do that, you can use this mechanism. So you couldn't use this with Bitcoin, for instance, unless Taproot gets implemented or something. But you could use this on something like Syscoin, which is using UTXOs under the hood, or even potentially like Fuel, which is using UTXOs under the hood. As far as like the actual standards go for this, unfortunately, not at all. A good example of this is like chain IDs, right? We have chain IDs in the Ethereum ecosystem, and that's a really awesome standard for having a way for us to refer to all of these different EVM compatible chains. But we can't actually use chain IDs. We have to use something else because Nomad and Connext will be compatible with non-Ethereum chains where the concept of a chain ID doesn't exist. So instead, we've had to use this concept that Noman created called a domain, which is a different kind of identifier. So yeah, unfortunately, these are things that are still being figured out in real time.
Got it.
Going through the other questions in this, actually. So let's see. Do you see bridges becoming fundamental blocks between nation states exchanging currencies in the future? Ideally not. I think ideally we don't have national blockchains. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a blockchain in the first place. Like my whole goal with my whole reason for entering the space was like, let's find ways to build public goods that are not actually associated with a single country. And because like we do have public goods that are associated with a single country. The problem is that those public goods end up having like developing, nationalist like biases. They end up having basically you kind of adopt the like national policy of the country that the public infrastructure is running on top of, and that causes also like Google, for example, has aggressive censorship in many countries. I grew up in a country where there was aggressive censorship of Google, and it's not because of anything else. It's just because Google is an American company, and like a bunch of other American companies and American government were just like, yeah, no, absolutely not. We are not going to have this information be available there. And the same thing, of course, the same thing kind of applies to China. So ideally, they don't become fundamental blocks. My goal with like bridges is that we should end up in a world where like these things are completely permissionless. I would love to work towards a model where like our stuff is executing as zero knowledge in the future, and then it's also exhibiting like mixed net like behavior. So eventually like packets that are going between chains are like completely non-attributable. So like there's no possible way to know like, is this packet that I'm relaying, does it contain sensitive information? Is it coming from, who is it coming from? Who is it going to? All you could really do is just like blindly relay stuff and take fees for it. We still have to, we're still very far off from that, but like, I think that is the ultimate goal, is to like genuinely make this internet like, or web like. Are you just proving the state of the bridge of one side to the other? That means you can use different tree systems on different networks as long as the data structure is understood on the receiving end. Yes. We just at the moment like, so the proof itself is really just like we post it and then nobody disagrees with it, which is kind of cool. The nice thing about fraud proofs is like there's almost zero like dependencies. So like for instance, if you use like a native bridge like IBC or something, even if you like try to reduce the costs of that native bridge using zero knowledge, you now have all of these like ZK cryptography primitive dependencies that like are completely different on each chain. And not only are they completely different, but even the same primitives implemented on different chains have like slightly different implementations. So like some of them just have like artifacts associated with like the way that they're implemented that causes them to be interpreted in slightly different ways because apparently we just hate standards. So I think it's true, yes, that we could use like any sort of data structure. The nice property is that like we can use the simplest possible data structure, which in this case is just a Merkle tree, for like proving inclusion, and then the proof of the state is also just aggressively simple by just being a proof of not being incorrect by anybody else. A question I'm interested: how should audit orgs approach bridge security given the diversity of talent needed to cover all the integrations on bridge attack surface? Yeah, that is a very good question. I think, to be honest, bridges are just like I feel like the scope. I feel like audit as a space is going to end up having to like bifurcate into a bunch of different like tiers where there's like the level of skill needed to audit just XYZ random shitcoin DeFi protocol is not very high. And I mean, it's high, but it's like it's nowhere close to the level of skill needed to understand like the intricacies of all of these different types of systems. And neither is it the level of skill needed to understand like the intricacies of like a blockchain or like some low level cryptographic primitives. So I think we're going to have to start seeing like a wider range of classes of audit in the space. I think like, audit orgs, how they should approach this problem should just be like, only the more sophisticated folks should be auditing this stuff to begin with, because like realistically doing a static contract audit on top of some new bridge design is not really going to help that much unless that bridge design is like well established as being secure. It's the same as trying to audit like an optimistic rollup. It's like fundamentally new system, so you need to spend a lot more time thinking about like the other kinds of attack vectors that exist around it. But yeah, I mean, bridges like we're unfortunately going to be one of the biggest like security holes in the space for a while. It's just like it's a given because of like the potential risks, the like systemic need for bridges and the potential risks associated with them and the like attack surface.
So Arjun, as a follow up to that, so what would your ideal training curriculum look like though to get, because we have some apprentices in the room today, if they could take a year or two just to focus on bridge security, what would that like master's curriculum, so to speak, look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like it's really, really key to understand a combination of two things. And I think what I've generally seen is that like bridge builders, even the more sophisticated bridge builders who are trying to like genuinely build secure bridges, like end up focusing only on one, not the other. The first is like the more kind of like, I guess three things. The first is traditional distributed systems and like understanding at a deep level how those work and why they work the way that they do, and like how the core properties of liveness and safety apply to blockchains and to other kinds of systems that exist in the space. Then cryptographic primitives. So depending on whether the bridge itself is relying on very, very deep cryptographic primitives, understanding at a very deep level what those primitives do and why they work the way that they do, and like what security guarantees they actually have. Because I think like something that happens in our space a lot right now is like people hand wave and say, oh, this like really like, SMPC, right, is the quintessential example of this, or people are like, no, SMPC can be used to like create secure bridges because like no one can like tamper with the SMPC environment and things like that, especially if it's running on like a trusted execution environment. And like I really want to spend more time digging more deeply into like the cryptographic assumptions there, but my intuition says that unless you're building like very, very specialized chipsets that are designed to like verify bridge transactions only, you are going to be introducing some trust assumptions in the form of you have to run some code somewhere that is going to say like, okay, this thing is correct or it's not correct, and I'm going to sign. So I think that there's, and I'm willing to kind of be wrong there, but like those are the kinds of assumptions that I think like we probably need to spend more time verifying. And then the last thing I think, which is something that definitely is very, very understudied in the space, and there's really no good material on this, is just like L2 design. How do you actually design these types of trust minimized systems? This is like a field that has unfortunately, only really like 1,000 people in the world, if that, really spent a lot of time looking into over the past few years. And then like of those people, no one really has gone and written a textbook because everybody's busy actually building projects or doing research still. And so I think it's a little bit challenging that you really have to like look into the history of these systems and understand like what were the set of what was like the thought process that led to us building things the way that we built them, and like why are these things, like what are the game theoretical and like cryptoeconomic principles that result in fraud proofs being the way that they are, and what other kinds of proofs can we construct that rely on game theoretic mechanisms to improve the core the core security of these systems. I know that's not a very helpful answer because I know that those are three very, very wide fields that are quite unrelated to each other. But I think like those appear to be the primitives on top of which a lot of our assumptions are being built in the bridge space.
I think that was a great answer. And I know for a fact that there's some folks in the audience right now that are taking notes and are going to go study that, because we need more talented auditors that can actually understand like the true attack surface of these bridges. So speaking of that, Axic has a follow-up. Can you list one or two big bridge hacks which should have been easily avoidable by properly reviewing the overall system as opposed to reviewing different ends independently? So, we're not asking this question in terms of trying to call anyone out. It's just more of how can we as a community, learn in a kind of a dispassionate way?
100%. So there's different kinds of bridge hacks, right? There's like implementation hacks on like a single chain, like basically like the contract implementation itself was borked, and like nobody really did a great job of that, like a great job of auditing it to begin with. Then there are attacks that happen because of the complexity of dependencies on different chains. So an example of the first one, I guess the biggest example of the first one is Poly Network, where like there were just like core issues associated with the contracts that people just didn't spend enough time verifying. And that was something where like just better auditing of the current form would have just helped. In the second case, there are dependencies. There's basically the differing dependencies on different chains that need to be holistically looked at, that may result in a security vulnerability existing on one chain but not others. And a great example of this was the wormhole hack, where there was a vulnerability in the cryptographic dependencies that existed on Solana that had never been updated by the wormhole team. And again, this stuff is so hard. Like the wormhole team is Certus One, and they're like one of the best security teams in the space. Like this so much of this is just luck. It was ludicrous that happened in the first place. But like, it's like I genuinely understand that sort of thing can really just happen to anyone. So that's another one that like is, I think, requires a little bit more of a holistic view. But I think the most the best example of so I think that the last version, and this is the one that we haven't seen a lot of yet, but I think we're going to start seeing increasingly going forward, is a compromise of the root of trust itself. And I think the best example of this is the Ronin bridge hack, where they compromised 5 out of the 9 multisig signers. And like I think so. To be clear, the Ronin bridge hack would not have happened on an optimistic bridge. There would just be no way to make that happen, because fundamentally, like even if you compromised all of the watchers in an optimistic bridge, you still wouldn't be able to execute fraud unless you also compromise the updater. There's like a fundamentally different pattern there, where like you need to compromise everyone all at once in order to actually like attack the system. And in the Ronin bridge hack case, like there, no amount of auditing would have really saved them either, right? Like I think it was obviously there were like poor off-chain security practices that they could have improved, but fundamentally the vulnerability there is just that like 5 out of 9 multisig is just not enough. It's just not secure enough to secure a ridiculous amount of money, and it's also definitely not decentralized, and it's definitely not it's definitely like a permission system. Even if you don't have even if your system isn't attacked by actual attackers, it can still be attacked in other ways. You could still have the US government say, okay, actually, we don't want Axie Infinity to exist anymore. The way that we're going to shut the system down is just to go after the bridge, because the bridge is the main point of vulnerability here. And we're just going to go shut down like five places that they're running servers that are signing. And like, what are they going to do at that point? So I think that's like, I would say like, we have yet to really hit the extreme cases. We're getting there. And by extreme cases, I mean the cases where it's like we have economic attacks on these systems rather than just like implementation attacks. But I think it's only a matter of time.
And this will be our final question, and I think we're going to wrap this up at the top of the hour. From Axic, do you think that the technical risks will go down, but then the social engineering risks, or to your point, Arjun, in your previous answer, kind of the corporate security risks will continue to go up for bridge security?
Yes. Yeah, I think like we're already seeing like this transition that's happening where it's like, you know, I mean, there's still just like many absolutely trash bridges that are out there, but I think people are kind of realizing, okay, well, let me just like the market is now evolving to the point where people are looking at like brand names and things like that. But in many of these cases, like the brand name bridges themselves are they're like insecure constructions, or they're trusted constructions. But it's sort of like it's a good way to put this. Like it's sort of like running an extremely centralized blockchain. Like, you know, like if you're running BSC or something like that, like it can still be fine. You can still operate it correctly, like because the core team is still incentivized to make sure this thing works well, and they're still going to ensure it. And because they're still going to ensure it, like there's mechanisms to enforce that. You know, like they will have internal mechanisms to enforce that, like the system doesn't go down or doesn't cause people to lose funds. And so generally in those cases, you're kind of like trusting the team. But if the outcome is that, if like the outcome of the space is that we're just saying, oh, well, let's just trust the teams to do a good job of securing our funds and maintaining custody, then really we haven't gotten anywhere, right? Then you might as well just have bridges be built by banks. Like why would you use a decentralized bridge? Just use a centralized exchange. You can trust that way more. They're actually federally insured. And like the centralized exchange does the exact same thing. I mean, at that point, like the bridge that you're building is going to end up becoming a centralized exchange eventually anyway, right? Because people at some point, regulators are going to be like, wait, this is just run by one company. Let's just make them do KYC. This is an exchange. So yeah, I mean, I think like there is a range on the spectrum. But to get back to your question, like I think like we are now getting to the point where people are starting to become more aware of like, okay, these things need to be audited, obviously. The audits need to be done by high quality people, and like there are like big risks associated with the audits not being like done in the first place, or not being done extremely well. And so, but at the same time, you also have attackers that are becoming more sophisticated and realizing, oh, we don't really need to attack the implementation. We can attack, you know, the signers. We can go execute a flash loan to, you know, like wash out the stake in the system. We can go like borrow a bunch of capital. Like, you know, you could build a DAO that like raises enough capital to like manipulate the price of Rune to make Thorchain completely insecure and then attack Thorchain. Like that is 100% possible to do. And like, is that going to happen right now? Probably not. But will it happen at some point? It's possible. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be attempted at some point, at least.
That was a great final answer. Pending any like wrap up thoughts from you, Arjun? Do you have any closing thoughts? And then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, I mean, I think like bridges are hard. Like this is probably like this is probably the single biggest change to like the way that we think about blockchains that we've ever done. And the change being that we're just moving to, you know, what we call asynchronous solidity, which is just like let's move away from having everything execute in a single environment, which is very easy to like reason about, very easy to kind of like build products in this way. Really, like the skills that you're utilizing to build, you know, a bunch of things on a single contract on a single chain are like in most cases for most DeFi protocols are like the average skills of a software of like somebody who has just taken their first like AP computer science class. Right, and who has never encountered a web application where they have to deal with asynchrony. They've never had to deal with a promise or had to deal with some remote resource. But now we're getting to the point in this space where it's like we are having to deal with asynchrony because that is how the space scales. And like, I think that's going to bring a lot of challenges with it, and a lot of like, there's just a lot that needs to still be understood. So yeah, I guess my closing thought is just like, if you're at all interested in it, I think there's just like a huge opportunity. This is not going to go away. It's not a problem that's going to be fixed. It's sort of like blockchain scalability, where it's like, this is just like two sides of the same coin. This will continue to be the story of, this is the next chapter of blockchains after Bitcoin and like kind of monolithic chains like Ethereum. And this chapter will continue to be thought about and developed for at least another decade, if not longer.
Promising future it is. Well, thank you very much, Arjun, for taking the time. Thanks everyone in the audience for asking great questions. And we'll wrap this up, and we'll see you all again for another seminar coming soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.